Something exploded after the Chinese Grand Prix, and almost nobody saw it coming. Because while the world was watching Mercedes dominate in Shanghai, a much bigger problem was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Max Verstappen retired. Red Bull exposed serious reliability issues. McLaren did not even start the race. And suddenly, drivers across the grid started questioning the brand new regulations that were supposed to define the future of Formula One. This was only the second race of the 2026 season. And already, the paddock is asking a dangerous question. Did the FIA get the new rules wrong? Because the promises were huge. Closer racing. Smarter aerodynamics. A revolutionary hybrid system. But in China, we saw something very different. Cars retiring. Electrical failures. Teams completely lost with the new technology. And one detail that most fans completely missed may explain why Verstappen was absolutely furious after the race. A detail that could put the FIA under enormous pressure if this continues. But to understand why the entire paddock is starting to worry, we need to look at what really happened in Shanghai. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, because what happened after the Chinese Grand Prix might change the entire 2026 season. Right after the Chinese Grand Prix ended, the atmosphere in the paddock felt different. Not celebratory. Not calm. Tense. Because what happened in Shanghai was not supposed to happen this early in the new era of Formula One. This season introduced the biggest technical reset the sport has seen in years. Completely new cars. Completely new power units. And a radical aerodynamic philosophy built around active wings replacing the old DRS system. The FIA spent years designing these rules. Years promising a new generation of racing. Cars that could follow closer. Cars that would fight longer. Cars that would make Formula One more competitive than ever. But the Chinese Grand Prix was the first real moment where those promises met reality. And reality looked chaotic. Mercedes dominated the race with a level of control that surprised even their own rivals. Andrea Kimi Antonelli delivered the first victory of his Formula One career. A calm, calculated drive that placed him directly in the history books. Right behind him came George Russell. A perfect 1-2 finish. The kind of result that immediately sends a message through the entire grid. Mercedes understood the new regulations faster than everyone else. But that was only the beginning of the story. Because while Mercedes were celebrating, several of the biggest teams in Formula One were fighting completely different battles. Ferrari showed strong pace. Lewis Hamilton secured his first podium with the team after an intense fight with Charles Leclerc. The two Ferrari drivers even touched lightly during their battle, a moment that quickly went viral among fans watching the race unfold. But the bigger headlines came from the teams that never reached the finish line. Max Verstappen retired. Fernando Alonso retired. And McLaren suffered one of the most shocking moments of the entire weekend. Neither Lando Norris nor Oscar Piastri even started the race. Both cars were forced out before the lights went out due to electrical power unit problems. Think about that for a moment. Two cars, from a top team, out of the race before it even began. And suddenly the paddock started asking the question nobody wanted to ask this early in the season. Are these new cars too complicated? Because the 2026 regulations were designed to simplify one part of Formula One. Aerodynamics. Ground effect dependence was reduced. The DRS system was removed. And in its place came something completely new. Active aerodynamics. Front and rear wings that change configuration automatically depending on the situation. Low drag on the straights. Maximum downforce in the corners. On paper, it sounds brilliant. But the first races are revealing something engineers already feared. When multiple systems depend on each other, the margin for error becomes incredibly small. The aerodynamic platform must be perfect. The hybrid system must deliver energy at exactly the right moment. And the electronics controlling those transitions must work flawlessly. If one element fails, the entire car falls apart. Exactly what we saw in China. And this is where the Verstappen situation becomes far more interesting. Because his retirement was not caused by a crash. It was not a simple mechanical failure. It was a problem in the energy recovery system, the ERS. And under the new rules, that system is no longer just an assistant to the engine. It is one of the most critical performance elements of the entire car. If the electrical side fails, the car simply cannot compete. Which means reliability in this new era is not just important. It is everything. And for Red Bull, that realization came in the worst possible way. In front of the entire world. But here is the detail that most fans completely missed after the race. Because while teams were analyzing failures, drivers were already starting to talk about something else. Something much more concerning. The way these new cars actually feel to drive. And that is where the next part of this story becomes even more serious. But the real tension after the Chinese Grand Prix did not come from the garages. It came from the drivers. Because once the helmets came off, the tone of the conversations began to change. Quietly at first, then a little more openly. And the issue they kept returning to was something most fans cannot see during a race. The feeling of the car. The way these new machines behave at the limit. Because the 2026 cars do something very different from the previous generation. They constantly change their aerodynamic configuration while the driver is pushing flat out. On the straights the wings open to reduce drag. In the corners they close again to produce downforce. This transition happens over and over again during a lap. And when everything works perfectly, the car feels incredibly fast. But when the balance is even slightly off, the result can be extremely uncomfortable for the driver. The rear of the car can suddenly feel lighter. The front can lose grip earlier than expected. And the driver must react instantly. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. That might not sound dramatic. But in Formula 1, confidence in the car is everything. Drivers operate on instinct. They turn the wheel knowing exactly how the car will respond. If that confidence disappears for even half a second, the lap time disappears too. Several drivers have already hinted that the operating window of these cars is very narrow. Much narrower than expected. Which means a setup that works perfectly on one lap can feel unstable on the next. Temperature changes. Energy deployment. Aerodynamic mode switching. Everything interacts. And when you combine that with the increased importance of the hybrid system, the complexity multiplies. Because drivers are no longer just managing tires and fuel. They are managing energy recovery, battery deployment, aerodynamic modes, and the timing of all those systems together. At 300 kilometers per hour. And that brings us back to Max Verstappen. Because throughout his career Verstappen has always been brutally honest about one thing. He wants a car that feels predictable. A car that responds immediately. A car that allows him to attack. But the early signs of the 2026 season suggest something very different. A car that requires management. A car that demands patience. A car that sometimes punishes aggression. And if there is one driver on the grid who hates driving limitations, it is Verstappen. The retirement in China only amplified that frustration. Because while Mercedes cars were circulating with stability and control, the Red Bull looked far more fragile. The ERS failure was the final blow. But according to several paddock insiders, the team already knew before the race that the operating window of the car was extremely tight. Small mistakes in energy deployment. Small setup changes. Even small temperature shifts. All of it could affect performance dramatically. That is the kind of scenario that drivers hate. Not because they cannot adapt, but because it removes something fundamental. Control. And when a driver like Verstappen feels that the car is controlling the race more than the driver is, frustration is inevitable. But here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous for the FIA. Because the moment multiple drivers start questioning how the cars behave, the debate stops being technical. It becomes political. Teams start asking whether the rules need clarification. Engineers start pushing for adjustments. And suddenly the governing body is forced into a very delicate position. Change the rules too quickly, and you admit the system was flawed. Refuse to change them, and risk a growing backlash from teams and drivers. And after what happened in China, that pressure might already be starting to build. But the most explosive part of this entire situation has nothing to do with Red Bull, or Ferrari, or even Verstappen. It has to do with the one team that seems completely comfortable with these new regulations. Mercedes. Because if their advantage is real, the entire balance of power in Formula 1 could be shifting again. And this is where the story becomes even more uncomfortable for the FIA. Because if one team clearly understands a new regulation before everyone else, history shows what usually happens next. Dominance. That is exactly what Formula 1 tried to avoid with the 2026 reset. The entire purpose of the new rules was balance. Less aerodynamic turbulence. More competitive racing. More teams fighting at the front. But Shanghai delivered a signal that made several teams nervous. Mercedes did not just win. They controlled the race. Their car looked stable in every phase of the lap. Through the corners. On the straights. During long stints. And most importantly, during the transitions between aerodynamic modes. Those active wings that are causing headaches for several teams seemed completely under control on the Mercedes. The car changed its aerodynamic configuration smoothly. Predictably. Exactly the way the system was supposed to work. Which immediately raised a question inside the paddock. Did Mercedes solve the biggest challenge of the new regulations before anyone else? Because the true difficulty of the 2026 cars is not raw speed. It is integration. the interaction between the hybrid system, the aerodynamics, and the chassis platform. When those three elements work together perfectly, the car becomes extremely efficient. Low drag on the straights, stable downforce in the corners, strong energy recovery, consistent tire performance. That combination is exactly what we saw in Shanghai. Mercedes managed their tires better. Their energy deployment looked smooth, and their aerodynamic transitions did not appear to disturb the balance of the car. That level of stability is incredibly powerful over a race distance. It means the driver can push, lap after lap, without fighting the car. And in Formula One, that is often the difference between winning and simply surviving. Meanwhile, several rivals looked like they were still trying to understand their own machines. Red Bull struggled with reliability. McLaren suffered electrical failures before the race even started. Aston Martin lost Fernando Alonso due to severe vibrations in the car. Each of these issues might look unrelated, but engineers across the paddock are starting to suspect they are connected by one common factor: the complexity of the new systems. Active aerodynamics, advanced hybrid deployment, new cooling demands, and extremely tight operating windows. When all of those systems must function perfectly together, development becomes incredibly difficult. One small change can create unexpected consequences somewhere else in the car. A modification to the hybrid system might alter cooling requirements. Cooling changes can affect aerodynamic flow. Aerodynamic changes can influence the stability of the chassis. And suddenly a simple upgrade becomes a massive engineering puzzle. Mercedes appear to have solved that puzzle earlier than the rest. But here is where the situation becomes politically explosive. Because if one team has already found the optimal concept, the others will inevitably start questioning the regulations themselves. Not publicly at first, but internally. Through technical meetings. Through FIA clarification requests. Through quiet conversations between team principals. Formula One has seen this pattern many times before. Whenever a regulation produces a clear early advantage, the pressure to modify the rules slowly begins to grow. Sometimes those changes are small. Technical clarifications. Adjustments to certain parameters. Sometimes they become much bigger. Entire rule interpretations can shift during a season. And that is the scenario the FIA desperately wants to avoid. Because changing rules too early damages credibility. But ignoring growing concerns from teams can create even bigger conflicts. Right now the championship has only completed 2 races. 2 races. And already we have seen multiple retirements linked to electrical systems. Multiple teams struggling with stability. Drivers openly discussing how difficult these cars are to operate. And one team looking almost completely comfortable. That contrast is what makes the situation so dangerous. Because if the pattern we saw in China continues in the next races, the pressure inside the paddock could escalate very quickly. Teams will demand answers. Engineers will push for clarifications. Drivers will speak more openly. And if someone like Max Verstappen begins criticizing the regulations publicly, the conversation could explode overnight. But the most fascinating part of this story is that the FIA might already know something the public does not. Because hidden inside the new regulations is a detail that could explain why some teams are comfortable, and others are completely lost. A detail that almost nobody noticed when the rules were first published. And that detail might determine who really controls the 2026 championship.